I never expected to be mocked at my cousin's baby shower for being plain and ordinary. But when my boyfriend walked in, the same man they'd been gossiping about all afternoon, their champagne glasses nearly shattered. Sometimes the most unassuming package holds the most extraordinary surprise. Have you ever been judged before someone really knew you? This story might just remind you why appearances can be deceiving. Stay until the end to see how one woman's quiet dignity turned the tables on those who underestimated her. I've always been the kind of person who blends into the background, not in a sad way. I actually prefer it. I work at the local library, spend my weekends tending to my small garden, and find joy in the simplest things like a perfect cup of tea or finishing a good book. My friends tease me for wearing the same comfortable sweaters and jeans, but I've never seen the point in splurging on things that don't bring me genuine happiness. That's why what happened with Thomas still feels like something from someone else's life. We met on an ordinary Tuesday at the coffee shop near my apartment. I was struggling with an armful of books when I bumped into him. Literally. My stack went flying, and as we both knelt to gather them, our eyes met over a dog-eared copy of Pride and Prejudice. He smiled, and something inside me just shifted. "You're a Jane Austen fan?" he asked, his voice warm and deep. I nodded, suddenly feeling shy despite being 32 years old. Me too, though I always thought Mr. Darcy needed to lighten up a bit. And just like that, we talked for 2 hours straight, forgetting about the cooling coffees in front of us. Thomas wasn't what you'd expect. Despite his expensive watch and perfectly tailored suit, there wasn't a hint of arrogance about him. He listened, really listened, when I spoke about my passion for connecting children with books that might change their lives. And when he talked about his work, it was never about the money or status, but about creating something meaningful. Our first date was supposed to be dinner at what I later learned was the most exclusive restaurant in the city. But when I mentioned I'd rather be somewhere I could laugh without worrying about which fork to use, his face lit up. We ended up at a hole-in-the-wall pizza place, sharing stories until they had to kindly ask us to leave because they were closing. As weeks turned into months, Thomas became woven into the fabric of my life. He'd bring me wildflowers picked from the side of the road because he noticed they matched the ones in my favorite painting. We'd spend rainy Sundays reading in comfortable silence, occasionally reaching out just to touch each other's hand. When he kissed me for the first time on my tiny balcony under a full moon, it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. I'll never forget our first weekend away together. I was nervous, not about being with him, but about fitting into his world. He surprised me by booking a cozy cabin by a lake instead of some luxury resort. We spent 3 days hiking, making s'mores by the fire and falling asleep to the sound of rain on the roof. On the last night, as we swayed together to old records with no music but the crackling of the fireplace, I knew I was falling in love with him. Through it all, I kept our relationship mostly to myself, not because I was embarrassed. How could I be? But because what we had felt sacred somehow, too precious to be examined under other people's microscopes. My coworkers noticed the extra spring in my step, and my closest friend Lisa knew the basics, but the depth of what I felt for Thomas and the life we were building together remained largely private. So when my cousin Rachel's baby shower invitation arrived, complete with a gold embossed +1 option, I hesitated. Rachel and I had grown up together, but drifted apart as she climbed the social ladder through her marriage to Edward. Her life was all designer labels and charity galas now, the polar opposite of mine. Thomas was out of town that weekend anyway, so I RSVP'd for just myself, never imagining how that ordinary Saturday afternoon would change everything. Rachel's baby shower was exactly as I'd expected, overwhelming. The moment I stepped into her sprawling suburban home, I felt like I'd wandered onto a movie set. Everything gleamed, from the marble countertops to the crystal champagne flutes being passed around by actual servers in uniforms. I clutched my modestly wrapped gift, a collection of classic children's books I'd carefully selected, and tried to blend into the background. Emma, you came? Rachel exclaimed, waddling over in a designer maternity dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her hug was genuine but brief as her attention was pulled away by another guest. Help yourself to some food and drinks, she called over her shoulder, already being swept into a conversation about baby photographers. I found a quiet corner near the food table, grateful for my practical flats as I watched other women teetering on heels that looked like beautiful torture devices. My simple blue dress, the nicest thing I owned, suddenly felt like a Halloween costume. Not because it wasn't pretty, but because among the sea of designer labels and professionally styled hair, I might as well have been wearing a sign that said, "Not one of you." Is that from last season's Target collection? The voice came from behind me, dripping with faux sweetness. I turned to see three women, all perfect teeth and highlighted hair, cocktails in hand. The one who had spoken, Bridget, I would later learn, gave my dress a once-over that made me feel naked. I'm not sure, I answered honestly. I've had it for a while. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes. How sustainable of you, another one said, and they all tittered like it was the most clever thing ever spoken. I should have walked away, found Rachel, or simply gone home. Instead, I stood rooted to the spot as they continued their conversation as if I weren't there. Did you hear who's coming later? Edward's brother, said the third woman, leaning in conspiratorially. Thomas? I thought he was in Chicago for that tech conference, Bridget replied. Apparently, he flew back early. God, that man is delicious and loaded. They all nodded in solemn agreement. I wonder what kind of woman finally caught him. He's been so secretive about her. Probably some supermodel with a PhD, one of them sighed. You know how those tech guys are. They want the whole package. Something warm spread through my chest. They were talking about my Thomas, who had told me he was flying back Sunday, not Saturday. My Thomas, who had kept our relationship private not because he was hiding me, but because he valued our privacy just as much as I did. I'm seeing someone, I said, surprising myself. The words just tumbled out. Three pairs of eyes locked onto me like predators spotting wounded prey. You? Bridget's perfectly penciled eyebrow arched so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. And what does he do? He's in tech, I said simply. The laughter that followed made my cheeks burn. Not a kind, shared laughter, but the cutting kind that separates people into categories, those who belong and those who don't. Honey, said one of them, placing a manicured hand on my arm. I'm sure he's very nice, but when we say tech, we don't mean the guy who fixes computers at Best Buy. Let me guess, Bridget continued, looking me up and down. You met him online? Be careful with those dating apps. My housekeeper's daughter was catfished by a man claiming to be a surgeon. Turned out he drove an ambulance. More laughter. I stood there, clutching my paper plate with trembling hands, as they continued speculating about Thomas and what his mystery woman must be like. Beautiful, sophisticated, accomplished, everything they clearly thought I wasn't. I mean, can you imagine someone like her? Bridget gestured vaguely in my direction. With someone like Thomas Davis? Edward says he's about to take his company public. The valuation is in the billions. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I hadn't known about the company going public. Thomas rarely talked about money, and I rarely asked. It simply wasn't what mattered between us. Excuse me, I managed to say, setting down my plate and turning to find the bathroom. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, not because I believed what they were saying, but because their casual cruelty was so unexpected. I had spent my entire adult life being kind to others, and somehow, in this room full of expensive things and beautiful people, that counted for nothing. As I reached for the bathroom door handle, I heard a familiar voice from the entryway, a voice that made me freeze mid-step and my heart leap into my throat. "Sorry I'm late," Thomas called out. "Traffic from the airport was a nightmare." I stood frozen, one hand still on the bathroom doorknob. Thomas was here, the same Thomas they'd been gossiping about all afternoon. The same Thomas who supposedly couldn't possibly be interested in someone like me. From where I stood, I could see him clearly. He looked tired from his flight, but handsome as ever, in dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt. A beautifully wrapped gift was tucked under his arm as he greeted Edward with a warm handshake. My heart hammered in my chest as I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to hide in the bathroom until this whole nightmare was over. But a stronger part, a part I didn't always know existed, propelled me forward. The room had shifted when Thomas walked in. The constant chatter dimmed to hushed whispers as women straightened their dresses and tossed their hair. I could see Bridget and her friends positioning themselves strategically in his sight line, their predatory smiles making my stomach turn. "Thomas," Rachel exclaimed, waddling over to embrace her brother-in-law. "We thought you weren't coming back until tomorrow." "Changed my flight," he said, handing her the gift. "Couldn't miss celebrating baby Davis, could I?" And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Thomas lifted his gaze and looked directly at me. The smile that spread across his face, slow, warm, and full of such genuine joy, made everything else in the room fade away. Without hesitation, he walked toward me, weaving through clusters of Rachel's friends without so much as a glance in their direction. "There you are," he said softly, reaching for my hand as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And then, in front of everyone, he leaned down and kissed me. Not a polite peck, but a real kiss, the kind that told everyone exactly what we were to each other. "I thought you weren't back until tomorrow," I whispered when we broke apart, acutely aware of the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. "Missed you too much," he said simply. "Caught an earlier flight." It was only then that Thomas seemed to notice the atmosphere. His brow furrowed slightly as he looked around at the frozen faces staring at us. "Everything okay?" "Thomas," Rachel's voice cut through the tension, an octave higher than normal. "You? You know Emma?" The confusion on his face would have been comical under different circumstances. "Of course I know Emma. We've been together for 8 months." He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. Did I miss something? Before I could answer, Bridget stepped forward, her perfect smile now fixed and brittle. "Thomas Davis," she purred, extending her hand. "We were just getting to know your girlfriend. Emma was telling us all about your relationship." I watched as understanding dawned on Thomas's face. He was perceptive enough to read the room, to see the discomfort in my eyes, to piece together what must have happened before he arrived. "Were you?" he asked, his tone cooling noticeably. His arm slid protectively around my waist. "And what exactly did you learn about us?" Bridget faltered, her confidence wavering under his steady gaze. "Just that, well, that you work in tech." A small, dangerous smile played at the corners of Thomas's mouth. Emma's being modest, as usual. What she probably didn't mention is that we met when she helped me research the educational framework for the literacy program my foundation is launching next year. Her insights were so valuable, I had to ask her to dinner. Professionally, of course. His eyes crinkled as he looked down at me. The falling in love part came later. My heart swelled as memories flooded back. Our first meeting hadn't been entirely accidental. Thomas had come to the library specifically to speak with me after a colleague recommended my work on early childhood literacy. The coffee shop, the bumping into each other, that had been real, but not as random as I'd made it sound. Emma sees the world differently than anyone I've ever met, Thomas continued, his voice warm with pride. She taught me that success isn't measured by acquisitions or valuations, but by the lives you touch. He squeezed my hand. I'd be half the man I am without her. The silence in the room was deafening. I could practically hear the mental calculations happening behind every pair of eyes as they reassessed me, recategorized me, wondered what they had missed about this plain woman in the simple blue dress. Rachel broke the tension, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "Well, this calls for a toast," she declared, shooting a pointed glare at Bridget and her friends. "To Emma and Thomas." As glasses were raised around us, Thomas leaned down to whisper in my ear. Why do I get the feeling I just walked into something? I stretched up on my tiptoes to whisper back, I'll tell you later, just kiss me again. And in front of all those watching eyes, that's exactly what he did. The rest of the baby shower passed in a blur of uncomfortable smiles and forced conversations. Thomas stayed by my side, his hand never leaving the small of my back, as if he could somehow shield me from the words that had already been spoken. I watched as Bridget and her friends made hasty exits, mumbling excuses about other commitments. The space they left behind felt lighter somehow, as if the air itself could breathe again. As the last guests trickled out, Rachel cornered us in the kitchen where Thomas was helping me wrap up leftover cake for her to keep. Emma, I am so sorry, she said, her eyes brimming with genuine remorse. I had no idea they would be so. I mean, I knew they could be a bit much, but that was inexcusable. It's not your fault, I assured her, surprised to find I actually meant it. The sting of those women's words had faded, replaced by something that felt strangely like gratitude.